Christ is risen. Dear ones, we come this Sunday to Thomas Sunday. And on Thomas Sunday, we venerate this very beautiful icon of Thomas touching the wound of Christ. For those who came during Orthros, forgive me, I forgot to bring the icon. I have one at home, but it's now in the back, so as you leave the church, right next to the icon of Saints Peter and Paul, you'll see it there. I talked last night, and every year I mention this fact that this icon is not just an icon of an event. In fact, the scriptures are very vague on whether or not Thomas actually reached out and touched the wound of Christ. They don't tell you. He says that. Unless I see the print of the nails in his hands and feet and see the wound in his side and touch them, I won't believe. But when you read the Gospels, it's not clear on whether simply seeing Christ was enough for Thomas, that he no longer felt the need to go touch, or whether he did reach out and touch. But the iconography always has him touching the wound. And the reason is that this icon, again, something I mention every year, is not just an icon of an historical event, but is an icon of theology. The icon of Thomas touching the wound of Christ is the image of what true theology is. Theology is not simply speculative, where we sit and think about God and think about the questions and philosophically delve through what we actually believe to be true or not true about God. This is what Thomas Aquinas did with his Summa. What people don't know about Thomas Aquinas, though, is that he had an experience touching Christ. Christ appeared to him. And after Christ appeared to him, he took a Summa and said, toss it in the fire. He said, everything that I've written is no better than straw fit for the fire. And he tried to get rid of all the copies. It didn't work. They spread throughout. But he realized that speculative theology is nothing compared to a true encounter with Christ. And Orthodoxy understands this, that theology is revealed. It's not us trying to speculate and contemplate God alone. It's God revealing himself to us. And the pure in heart have Christ appear unto them. They experience their own personal Pentecost. They have the experience of God directly given to them. And that's why we follow the saints. Because in the saints, we're following those who have had the experience of Christ and thus teach based on what God has revealed to them, not on simply what they've guessed about or thought through. This icon, though, is more than just an icon of theology. It's also an icon of Christian living. In other words, it's an icon not only of true theology of the heart, but of practical theology. How do we live as Orthodox Christians? So what do I mean by this? That this is an icon of practical Christian living. The Christian life is one in which we seek to ceaselessly reach out and touch Christ. To be in communion with, to be in contact with Christ. And what this means is that we seek in all things the will of God. We wish for our lives to be completely consistent with whatever God wills for us. What does Christ desire for us? What we desire personally is of the least importance when we're making major decisions. We worry very little about what we personally want. In the simplest, most base example I could give you, like on a fast day. On a fast day, we don't worry about what we are desiring to eat. We worry about what the fast day calls for. Because we seek to please Christ, and we know that he gave us fasting as a tool and a medicine, and we know that following his commandments is pleasing unto him. So we seek to please Christ and not ourselves, despite the fact that we really may desire that burger or that steak or whatever. So whenever we make decisions in life, we go through a hierarchy of thought. And the hierarchy of thought is this. The first question we ask when making a big decision: what is God's will for me? We seek God's will through prayer, through fasting, through talking with our priest. We seek God's will first and foremost. Underneath that question, what is a decision that is consistent with love? How can I make a decision here that is based in love and does not fight against love? The third question under that, what decision here is consistent with humility? Because I can't live true love if I'm not humble. Am I being led by pride, and is that pride distorting my thoughts to believe that this is the will of God when really it's about filling me? And by the way, we can make right decisions for the wrong reasons and thus have decisions that would be in line with the will of God suddenly work against God because we're prideful in them. The fourth question under that, what decision will be guided by wisdom and practicality? The decision I'm going to make, is it practical and wise for myself and my family? And then, after those four questions, what's consistent with the will of God? What's consistent with gospel love? What's consistent with humility? And what is wise here? Then and only then, we may ask, but we don't have to, we might ask, what do I desire? It may turn out that in a particular decision, there are two paths to go by that fulfill all of those categories. Either one could be in line with the will of God. Either one could be based in love. Either one could be a humble decision. Either one could be wise. And then, only then do we say, well, what do I really desire? But only at the very end of that process. To be led by our own will, to flip that hierarchy upside down and put our will first is a sign of immense pride within us. And it's a distortion of our baptismal promises. So the question becomes, well, how do we seek the will of God? How do we find it? First and foremost, we seek it in God's commandments. We know that nothing will be in line with the will of God that is somehow contrary to his commandments. And so we seek whatever God commands. What does Christ command in the Gospels? And then we seek the Scriptures and the Fathers. We see what a life consistent with the will of God looks like, and is our decision in line with that. And then we take it to prayer. And finally, for major decisions, we seek guidance from our spiritual father and other spiritual guides. This is the typical way that the Orthodox Christian seeks the will of God. To live seeking the will of God at all times, in every situation, means that we won't always get what we want personally. But the personal will, when our personal will is separated from the will of God, the will becomes our enemy. And we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that always seeking to get what we want when it's out of line with the will of God injures us. It harms us. And it harms our salvation. It removes grace from our hearts. And we end up falling backwards in the spiritual life. We can't forget that. The personal will, when it fights against the will of God, is the enemy. Which is why seeking to constrain our will and to reshape it so that it's in line and paralleled with the will of God is the Christian life. Think about this. If our will was always in line with the will of God, we would never sin. We would never sin if our will was perfectly in line with the will of God and we lived that out. Every sin can be based on the fact that we will something that goes against the law of God. So every bad decision you or I make is made because God's will is not sought first. It's not sought in love. It's not sought in humility. And in some cases, this can be absolutely devastating. Divorces, loss of careers, even medical disasters, I've seen every single one of them occur because people have not first sought the will of God. And in doing so, their personal will has been elevated as God above God. That personal will becomes at fault. It destroys us. The personal will is only sanctified and only beneficial, again, when we seek to conform it to the will of God. So I want to read for you a couple of quotes from saints who talk about this. And by the way, I want to mention, you may sit there and argue. You may argue that, well, if I'm never seeking my will, if I'm always seeking the will of God, and if the will of God seems to run against what I want, aren't I going to be a miserable person? But the Christian is miserable when his life is not pleasing to God. This is what makes us miserable. Not when we don't get what we want in this life. What really saddens the heart of a Christian is when we know that we've sorrowed our Lord. That's what makes us racked with anxiety and confusion and despair. But you see throughout the lives of the saints, people who have followed the will of Christ, even to their own seemingly personal detriment, and yet they ended up in the face of great persecution, in the face of torments, in the face of great loss. They end up completely at peace inwardly because they know that they're seeking Christ in all things, even against their own personal desires. So again, I want to read for you. The first is a little bit of a lengthy quote, but it's well worthwhile. It's from St. Silouan the Athonite. And St. Silouan writes this about seeking God's will over our own. He says, "The proud man does not want to live according to God's will. The proud man likes to be his own master and does not see that man has no wisdom, not nearly enough wisdom, enough to guide himself without God. How are you to know if you are living according to the will of God? Here is a sign. If you are distressed over anything, it means that you have not fully surrendered to God's will, although it may seem to you that you live according to his will. He who lives according to God's will has no cares. If he has need of something, he offers himself and the thing he wants to God. And if he does not receive it, he remains as tranquil as if he had gotten what he wanted in the first place. The soul that is given over to the will of God fears nothing, neither thunder, nor thieves, nor any other thing. Whatever may come, such is God's pleasure," she says. If she falls sick, she thinks, "This means that I need sickness, or God would not have sent it." And in this wise is peace preserved in soul and body. The man who takes thought for his own welfare is unable to give himself up to God's will, that his soul may have peace in God. But the humble soul is devoted to God's will and lives before him in awe and love. In awe, lest she grieve God in any way. In love, because the soul has come to know how the Lord loves us. The best thing of all is to surrender to God's will and bear affliction, having confidence in God. The Lord, seeing our affliction, will never give us too much to bear. If we seem to ourselves to be greatly afflicted, it means that we have not surrendered to the will of God. A lot of wisdom in that quote from St. Silouan. And I want to end with one other quote. It's a much shorter quote, just a couple sentences, from St. Seraphim Sarov. When I first read this was a life-changing quote for me. It's really powerful. St. Seraphim says this: "He who obeys in everything. But he who has renounced his will in one thing and has not renounced it in another has had his own will even in what he renounced. What is done in one's own way is not pleasing to God, even though it may seem good." That second line there, "He who has renounced his will in one thing has not renounced it in another has had his own will even in what he renounced." This is how we so often live. I'll follow these commandments, but not these. I'll follow this, but not that. I'll seek God in this way, but not in this way. I'll take this medicine, but not this one. And in doing so, all we're doing is being willful, even in the medicine we are taking, and that's why we aren't healed. Healing evades us. Because the one thing that gets us in trouble, self-will, not seeking the will of God first, self-will continues to reign. So, dear ones, in this Paschal season, contemplate, please. I beg you, contemplate this beautiful icon of Thomas touching Christ. And know that this is an icon of how we ought to live every single day in every major decision of our life, even small decisions. How can I reach out so that this decision brings me into greater contact with Christ and his will, rather than causes me to recoil and turn from him? May we be strengthened by the intercessions of St. Thomas the Apostle. May we be strengthened by the intercessions of St. Silouan and St. Seraphim in seeking the will of God in all things. Christ is risen.